Okay, we are live.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we are going to be continuing our conversations about PFAS and extending them also to a discussion about the Coventry landfill and planning for its future. And we have Representative Page with us this afternoon, who is a representative from Grant.
I should first say that I'm a resident of Newport. I represent Newport. When I first ran, Coventry was part of my district. It no longer is. But certainly one can see the landfill from Newport and at times can even smell it as well. I'm not an expert, okay, on PFAS or leachate. And I would just say that last time I was there at landfill with some of my Northeast Kingdom representative colleagues was around this time, maybe a year ago, next month, I think it was. We first heard about a spillage of leachate there. And we felt it was important to see the area where it had occurred. We had heard from some of our constituents about it. And I will say this about the landfill and its personnel. Whenever you call there and talk to, the head engineer, Mr. Labbe, they are always welcoming and friendly and open for you to go see what's going on there. And that's what we did. There was a group of us, maybe 4 or 5 of us, representatives of labor. Your vice chair was also present. We saw where the spillage had occurred. We saw what they had done to remediate it. And at the time, as I recall, it was cold and the leachate actually froze and they were able to collect it and remove it. And we also got the chance to see the machinery that takes the leachate and removes some items related to PFAS. And as I recall, that machinery was from the Australia area. It was imported. I think it's one of its kind. Cost, well, at least $1 million, maybe more, as I recall. So I tell that little story just to say how accommodating Casella is and how I think they try to do the best that they can under the circumstances. Despite that, yes, my constituents are concerned with the landfill. I'm concerned with it as well. I wish it was elsewhere, frankly, and I'm sure everybody does. I have submitted bills in the past. I haven't done it this term, asking for the state to try and locate a new site or to come up with ways to recycle more, reduce garbage, or just find another location that we can send our trash to. I think there's maybe 20 more years left in the usage of the Coventry landfill. And that time is going to go by rapidly. And we should be planning for what comes next now rather than waiting till the last minute. And I think that's also a fear of what may occur. So if there aren't any more questions, or if there aren't any questions, I'd be happy to entertain.
Representative Austin has.
Does the state compensate Coventry for housing the landfill?
Coventry does receive some monies. I don't know. Casella, but I don't know that for certain.
So is it fair to say that your constituents in the area are interested in just that long-term planning happening. That's what's.
Well, they're interested in long-term planning. They're also interested in water quality in the area. You know, as you know, we have Lake Memphremagog. There's a concern that, well, particularly with the spillage that occurred almost a year ago, there was concern that it might be going into the lake. It didn't. Casella did a very good job of handling it. But besides that, there is concerns regarding the leachate going into Lake Memphremagog.
Right. Any other questions for Representative Page?
I just wanted to say, I have a question, but I just do want to say that I am very grateful to Coventry for doing this. This is, you know,
Well,
and I always have been, like, I think, wow, that's really nice that they're doing that. That's all I wanted to say.
well, I'll just add on to that. The state should be grateful to Coventry and the Northeast Kingdom for accepting that landfill because that's the only one.
Yep.
And there are probably a number of residents that feel that that landfill is located where it is because it's out of sight, out of mind for most residents of Vermont.
And it's worth noting that a couple of summers ago, not this past summer, but the one before, this committee actually did a field trip. And most of the then members of it took quite an extensive tour of that facility. And would corroborate what you said, you know, it's for a landfill, it's clean and well run from the tour. Other, yeah, Representative Tagliavia.
You mentioned, I believe, a filtration system or something that was imported to this country to be used there. Was that an initiative that Casella took upon itself to do, to try to filter out?
I'm sure it was. You should ask them. But yeah, I think they're interested in being a good neighbor. And that was one of the things that I believe they took up. And I will say this, and I know you're here from Casella.
No.
That Casella, I think, does try to be a very good neighbor to the community. And does what it can. And I think it does follow the regulations that the state imposes on it.
All right, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Matt Chapman.
Afternoon. I am going to, if it's all right, run through a short presentation, though I'm happy to just make this incredibly informal and answer people's questions. And so for the record, my name is Matt Chapman. I'm the director of the Waste Management Prevention Division with the Department of Environmental Conservation. So I thought I'd go just a little bit of background on what we see as far as waste disposal in the state of Vermont. So Vermont generates around 370,000 tons of MSW, solid waste, a year. There's a little chart that I put in the presentation. I'm also happy to share a report. This is based off 2022 data, but we find the data is pretty consistent and we're a few years behind because of sort of reporting and analysis lags with the data. But so about 370,000 tons a year. It's been fairly consistent over the last several years. And then we generate about 110,000 tons of C&D, both of which often go into the landfill.
C&D is?
Construction and demolition debris, yes. Thank you. So Vermont has 2 permitted and 1 active landfill in the state. So New England Waste Services of Vermont in Coventry is the permitted and active landfill. They're permitted for up to 600,000 tons per year. They don't operate at that level. They operate normally at about 470,000 tons per year. There's another landfill in Sheldon, Vermont, in Northwest that is permitted but not built. It has a fill capacity of 20,000 tons per year. Just so folks know, 80% of Vermont's waste goes to New England Waste Services of Vermont. 20% goes roughly between New York and New Hampshire. Very little to none goes to Massachusetts. Currently, no out-of-state mixed solid waste, sort of traditional MSW, goes to New England, to Coventry. There are other types of waste there, like sludge, development soils from other jurisdictions.
As in contaminated development soil.
Yeah. So there's often this question of like, why don't we have more landfills in the state of Vermont? And actually, if people really want to dig into it, Vermont Public actually did a really great little podcast a couple weeks ago. And I'd encourage people, there's a link in the presentation. You can also go to the Brave Little State site and take a listen to it. But it was a good little sort of a picture on why we only have one operating landfill. The other reference that I have in here is there's a report that the state did in 2021 where we basically interviewed and looked at. And let me step back. When we first modernized solid waste management in the state, roughly speaking, in 1987, there were a number of different sort of thoughts around what the future might look like, but it really said a few things. One is that municipalities are primarily responsible for management of solid waste within their boundaries, and it authorized those municipalities to form things like solid waste districts to help manage that material. And I think it envisioned there being regional landfills built sort of throughout the state to manage waste within the state. Our findings, based on the conversations that we've had with people from solid waste districts and sort of the regulated entities, Vermont doesn't have enough waste, and modern landfills are too expensive to design to think that you can build smaller regional landfills and have them be anywhere near cost effective. So that's a challenge in sort of the sort of diffuse management of landfilling in the state. So that I think is one of the challenges. So as you're aware, we have one landfill, Coventry. It's basically on phase 6 of its build out based on its current sort of master plan. It has approximately 20 years of permit.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
A little distracted.
That's okay.
I'd love to hear your explanation for, why we only have one landfill.
Sure.
You gave you touched on scale.
Sure.
Are there other reasons?
I think it's scale. It's largely it's also an input issue, right? We generate, roughly speaking, 370,000 tons of trash, 400,000 tons of trash a year. In order for a landfill to operate, they need trash, right? They need to be able to fill and pay for the landfill cells that they open. And frankly, we have made a choice as a state that we're going to try to, and maybe this is good for me to take a step back and talk a little bit about how waste gets into landfills in Vermont. So we do have a state planning process. So my division basically does two things. We permit landfills, we regulate them from an environmental and facility operation perspective, and we do solid waste planning in the state. And as a part of that planning process, it requires each municipality to have what's called a solid waste implementation plan. So we basically have a set of statewide, let's call them performance objectives or programs that need to be in place, ranging from composting to hazardous waste reduction to recycling goals that we have as a state, and municipalities need to have a planning process that shows that they're meeting these sort of waste stream. They have programs in place to help meet these sort of larger objectives that we include in the state solid waste plan. And so the locality comes up with that plan, they provide it to the state, do that plan and approve it. once they have an approved solid waste implementation plan, they can now ship waste to a permitted facility in the state of Vermont. No plan, they can't bring the waste to a Vermont permitted facility.
So is it fair to say that the solid waste management districts are the vehicle by which our towns do this work?
Largely speaking, yes. So, basically solid waste management districts are, I mean, again, probably a bad analogy, but they're like a union of municipalities, right? They are a municipality in and of themselves, right? So they're their own sort of legal existence. And in order to satisfy their obligations to basically manage solid waste within their boundaries, certain municipalities have elected to form districts, right? So that district then assumes those responsibilities on behalf of its member municipalities. There are some municipalities that form what we call alliances, and those are basically more, I think, akin to like a regional planning commission, where there's still autonomy amongst the member municipalities, but there's a coordination and planning function that exists by the alliance heads that sort of coordinate amongst those municipalities. And for example, in the Mad River, that's an example. They have an alliance and not a district in the Mad River area. And some municipalities go it on their own and just basically handle their planning obligations as a municipality and don't join a district. And there are examples. Coventry is an example. Canaan is an example. Those are the two that come right off the top of my head, but there are others.
Do you know about how many of them?
I can get an exact number for you. I don't want to. We have been promoting sort of consolidation. I mean, effectively, trying to get municipalities to work with other municipalities to basically reduce the cost of services. I mean, it's not probably a surprise to this committee that the cost of household hazardous waste collection is one of the things you have to do. It's expensive and a driver. And it's sort of encouraged municipalities to coordinate and join districts over the past 10 or so years. Okay, so one permitted facility, we're in phase 6, excuse me. Phase 6 has approximately 20 years of capacity left. It has 3 years left on its permit. So 3 years of its permit life. It'll come in 3 years for a new permit. And it accepts 80% of the waste in Vermont.
Sorry, did you say we're in phase 6?
Yes. So if you look at the map, what you're going to see, and you should feel free to, so there's phases 1 and 2, phase 3, phase 4, and then we jump to phase 6. And you may be asking, well, what happened to phase 5? Phase 5 is basically a planned element at the landfill. There are 2 older unlined cells that pre-exist the facility life of this. There's part of the plan is to basically remove those unlined landfill cells, line them, and then fill them in. That is permitted, but there's not sort of I'll let Casella talk about where that is in their master planning process. All right. So getting to where does the PFAS come from? And I sort of put this slide up a lot of the time when we're talking about PFAS inputs into a landfill, but I think this is a good example of what the sort of large drivers of PFAS inputs into a landfill are. This is from a study that was done by News VT that was provided to the agency that shows basically textiles, carpets, and bulky waste, which are basically furniture, are the largest drivers from a mass perspective of PFAS coming into the landfill.
You said rugs, furniture,
Rugs and textiles.
textiles.
It says G per day.
Grams.
Is grams.
It is. So, and so I mean, again, I think, we can talk a little bit, I think it's good to get context around some of this, right? Like when you talk about grams per day, I mean, so grams per day is the mass. When we start talking about concentration, right? We talk about parts per trillion. And I've never done the conversion as to what 1 gram, when you take it and convert it to, but it's probably a lot, right? So, and there are different sort of measurements, right? So.
Wonder, wow, I shouldn't bring it up in front of this inquiring committee.
No, that's good. I mean,
How does this get calculated?
well, how does this get calculated?
Spray going into the landfill is obviously an estimate based on how many grams are in a sofa.
Right.
And is Casella doing that or?
So this was a report that was done in, I think, 2018 by Sanborn Head. And it paid for by Casella, but it was provided to the state. And, you know, again, there were several reports that we required as a part of Casella's last permit. One of those was basically the permit that the term we're currently in. One of the requirements that we required was that they look at 2 on-site and 2 off-site treatment technologies for PFAS and basically do sort of a desktop sort of lit review of the viability of PFAS treatment at the landfill, and they did that. The other was to basically look at the sources or inputs of PFAS into the landfill, and this was a part of. It's an incredibly comprehensive report that Sanborn Head put together about PFAS inputs and PFAS in the landfill. And so again, happy to provide the link if people really want to dig in and take a look at the information that was done. But I think it's a very helpful and useful report.
Mhm. Yes.
Okay,
Would
happy to
like
do that.
Yes, thank you.
So as a result of that, and I think the committee has sort of heard a little bit and talked about, there is a treatment system on there. It's a surface activated foam fractionation treatment system. And what you basically see is here's a picture of the unit itself from the facility. It's the blue box that's up there. And basically what foam fractionation is, and I may defer to Sam Nikolai from Casella to talk in more detail about this, because he certainly has seen like the data and is much, they're in charge of the pilot at the moment. But basically foam fractionation, the raw leachate goes in, air goes into the system, it bubbles, the PFAS adheres to those bubbles and attaches to the foam. The foam goes out in basically a waste stream. And then the effluent is captured with much less PFAS. The literature values with respect to removal is that there's a 99% removal value of long chain PFASs, shorter chain. There's less removal efficiency. And again, I think there's a calibration process that goes in, but it's 50% or more removal efficiency for your sort of shorter chain PFASs.
What concentration does that result in the water for in the leachate?
I have not seen the data, so maybe Mr. Nikolai can talk about what the data is coming out of the treatment process. So there's the effluent, right? The effluent goes off to the Montpelier wastewater treatment facility to be further treated and discharged, or to Plattsburgh and it's treated and discharged there.
And this foam ends up being, I think, encapsulated in concrete. And the concrete gets landfilled?
It is placed back in the landfill. So that's basically the summary of what I have for you. I'm certainly more than happy to ask you or answer any questions that folks had.
Thank you for that. Representative Nora.
Just so I understand the question you asked and answered, it was given sort of foam that has PFAS in it is taken out of the SAFF system and put back in on top of the.
So basically it's taken and placed in another tank, and then that tank is basically solidified into concrete blocks, and those concrete blocks are then taken and put back into the landfill. I mean,
And the stuff doesn't leach out of those concrete blocks. That's the idea.
the idea is that it's more stable when it's in the concrete blocks than just putting the foam back into the landfill.
Representative Tagliavia.
2 questions. Number one, to follow on Representative North's question. These concrete blocks, they're in the landfill? Are they checked? And how often for leaking, cracks, stuff like that?
So once they're back in the landfill, they're there, right? So there's no sort of observation. They kind of go in with everything else and they're covered.
Covered over.
Right, and so we're certainly having conversations with Casella about best management practices for how to manage this treatment media when it goes back into the landfill, to make sure that how it's being managed is managed appropriately. And I guess the other thing to put out there is just like I think, and Mr. Nikolai could talk about this, Casella is like actively looking for a number of different better encapsulation and treatment processes for the fractionate than solidification and putting it back in the landfill. I mean, I think it's important to understand, maybe just from a procedural standpoint, we're in a piloting phase right now, right?
It's another question.
You know,
I was
it's-
gonna ask.
We're very much trying to figure out what treatment technologies work well. And that's both from a treatment, but also from a destruction standpoint, right? And there are very few ways. There are a lot of innovative approaches and innovative technologies that are out there to treat and destroy PFAS. All of them need to be tested in a real world environment, and all of them are incredibly innovative at this point.
One other question. You said there were two permitted locations, and so only one operational. What is keeping the second permitted location from actually opening and being operable?
So I don't want to speculate on what what the Northwest Solid Waste District's reasons are for not opening that landfill. When you look at the permitted capacity, you know, Coventry has 600,000, they have 20. I think, you know, the cost of building out a modern double line landfill with leachate controls, it's going to be very expensive to build out a 20,000 ton landfill with the technologies that are required today.
What do you see the role of the state as in planning for the future of our solid waste management?
Well, so one of the things that we committed to doing in our state solid waste management plan is starting sort of a public process, public dialogue around the future of waste disposal in the state. And the plan is that we would start that dialogue this summer. We're sort of in the sort of preliminary process of planning, like what would that look like and how can we bring stakeholders into a process to have a conversation. But I mean, I think it's important, at least historically, Vermont has always, for the most part, let municipalities and the private sector be predominantly in charge of siting and building landfills. So we don't, I guess, and I should say siting from a macro, not a micro sense. You know, we certainly, if someone wants to build a landfill at a particular property, we'll have conversations about distance to surface waters, distance to wetlands, distance to groundwater, sort of how the facility, the geology of the facility, but not sort of whether you should build it in Newport or Bennington, right? Those are not conversations that the state has traditionally had a role in.
But we did, the legislature, I believe, ask you to look for appropriate sites in the past, and a number of them were identified. Do I have that right?
So I don't, if that happened, it happened before it happened in the sort of 1987 past, not in the recent past. We haven't had any sort of landfill spending process where we went out and looked at where landfills are located. We did provide you a report in 2021 that basically said, here's the why there's only one. Here are the sort of limitations associated with building multiple landfills in the state of Vermont. We have not sort of identified properties that you should build a landfill on. That's not something that we've done.
Now, have you looked at how other states deal with this?
Yes, and there's a range of different approaches that other states do. For example, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has no permitted landfills in it, right? They have basically everything is put on trucks and sent to New Hampshire, New York, Ohio, Alabama. They have a pretty large radius of where they're sending their waste and trucking their waste to. To the state of Maine has one state-owned landfill. There are other states that run incinerators.
Maine has more.
They have one state-owned landfill. They have more landfills than just the one state owned one, but they do have one that's owned by the state of Maine.
Getting conflicting information from two trusted resources. So
Interesting.
follow up on that.
Okay.
Um, Well, yeah, we'll follow up on that.
Oh, there are 5 waste energy facilities in Mass? Yeah, there are no landfills, there are waste to energy.
Energy facilities owned by the state.
In Massachusetts, there are 5 waste to energy facilities. I don't believe that any of them are owned by the state.
Oh, in Mass.
In Mass.
I was thinking Maine, back to Maine. Anyway, are you aware that any of Vermont's solid waste gets incinerated?
There may be some small amount of waste in the southern part of the state that's going into Massachusetts or south, and it's incinerated, but I think it's a small fraction of the waste that we generate in the state.
How concerned are you about the 20-year life capacity that's been identified in Coventry?
Not. I guess from 2 perspectives. Because I've seen other states basically manage their waste in the absence of there being in-state permitted capacity. The one thing that I will say that I do get concerned about more than anything is that an in-state disposal capacity is incredibly beneficial when there's a natural disaster and we're dealing with flood debris. In 2023, when there was a significant amount of material in Barre and Montpelier and frankly in Ludlow and other places, it was an invaluable to the state to have the ability to basically consolidate things at transfer stations and work with Coventry and News VT to make sure that that material got into the landfill.
Yeah, and potentially shortens the life of our landfill.
Definitely.
Representative Tagliavia.
Knowing that we have a housing shortage and we have an affordability crisis, if we, as a legislature, fix those, we're lucky enough to take credit for fixing those, and we do have a housing boom, what will that do to your 20-year window for the landfill?
I mean, I think it's hard to say. I mean, that's a function of C&D, construction and demolition debris sort of generation. There's a lot of efforts to recycle construction and demolition debris that's generated especially from new construction sites. Again, it's hard to estimate like how many of those sites are going to be renovations where you see a knockdown or significant demolition in advance of. So, I mean, it'll shorten it. No more natural disasters will shorten that time frame. I mean, there's a lot of things that put pressure on the capacity at a landfill. So that's why I think we're going to start the dialogue process with the public. But I mean, again, I think from some respect, our role in this process as the state is relatively limited as far as ensuring that there's additional capacity coming online as far as a landfill is concerned. And we're not advocating to step into the role of being a landfill owner operator.
Back to slide 2.
Sure.
Is it really possible that MRF residue is the same? Oh, it's all out of state.
It is all out of state. That is one of it is a waste stream that was authorized by the legislature to come in outside of a planned entity. So There is MRF residue that comes in from other jurisdictions and is disposed of.
MRF is a materials recycling facility for our new members.
Yes.
I'm sorry, what was it?
Materials recycling facility.
Yes.
Where's that coming from?
You know what, I may let Casella talk about the MRF residue portion of the stream. It's,
Okay. Representative Chapin and then Austin.
Can you just talk about, I understand you're not like leading on trying to find a site. Some of the solid waste districts do that work. Can you talk about whether it's a solid waste district or Casella or another entity was really looking at a specific site? Could you just take us through a timeline of, are we talking about a 10-year process to being able to accept new solid waste in a new facility, or is it, what does that timeline look like from the permitting perspective?
so I've been involved with the expansion of an existing permit multiple times, and that is a 3 to 5 year process. I think that if you were starting to build a new landfill sort of on an undeveloped site, I think the timeline would be longer than that 3 to 5 year process, probably considerably longer than that 3 to 5 year process.
Representative Austin.
Do you know of any emerging technologies in terms of waste disposal or recycling that look, possible or?
There's a lot of emerging technologies out there, and we seem to have like flyers coming from companies on a daily basis talking about some amazing technology that's going to destroy waste. To some degree, we certainly are up. We try to stay up to date with sort of the emerging treatment technologies, what the emerging contaminants are, how you treat for those emerging contaminants. I think I will probably defer to Sam to talk about what at the facility they've looked at to pilot or implement. We normally start from the standpoint of we're looking at what the contaminants of concern are and what sort of values are acceptable in humans or in the environment, as opposed to trying to look at a technology-based approach to dealing with it. Having said that, we're actually looking at a technology-based approach to treat PFAS from the landfill. So in other words, rather than looking at a number at the end of the pipe, we would be looking at a treatment technology as the basis for establishing the effluent limitations on the landfill.
Like there's more there what does that look like? You mean like a sort of an assumption that you're meeting the treatment needs based on the treatment?
Well, it's an assumption that you applied, and again, there's sort of under the Clean Water Act, there are multiple, but there are two primary treatment approaches. There's a technology-based effluent limitation and a water quality-based effluent limitation, and sometimes you have both. But basically, there is no effluent standard, at least at the moment. There are no human health-based effluent standards for leachate that exist right now and so we are using the data that's being developed at Coventry. We're going to be analyzing that and coming up with a set of standards based on the highest possible removal efficiencies that we can obtain from technologies out there. And again, Pete Laflamme is the director of the Watershed Management Division, is the better person to have a conversation about that with, but.
Well, and you're going to say that about my next question, I think,
Probably.
too. But so how closely you're sort of saying we, so you're working closely with Casella, you have staff working with Casella, how often in the facility, but then who's monitoring Lake Van for Magog, and how does that information get back to us?
Sure. So Casella, or excuse me, News VT has a number of different permits, right? So they're sort of supervised. They have a solid waste permit, an Act 250 permit, a pre-treatment discharge permit by the Watershed Management Division, and a Title V air permit for the air emissions from both methane and other emissions from the landfill. So there's sort of frankly, they're probably one of the facilities in DEC that touches every every major media program that we have. There are surface water monitoring efforts in both the Black River Wetland Complex and in Lake Memphremagog that are done by both, that are monitored by A&R personnel in some instances and through the ambient water quality monitoring efforts that Watershed Management does, the context of the in-lake monitor. Now, I'm going to say that's about the extent of what I know, and Pete can probably give you much more detail on what the results are. But I mean, in effect, we have not seen values in the lake that show that there's some PFAS source discharging into Lake Memphremagog or the Black River.
Do members have further questions for Mr. Chapman? All right. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Samuel Nicolai.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Sam Nicolai. I'm Vice President of Engineering for Casella Waste. I manage our engineering, permitting, and environmental compliance teams and have for about 10 years. Appreciate the opportunity. I'll make a few remarks, I think, about landfill siting and tonnage, and I'm happy to make a few remarks about PFAS and answer any questions that folks might have. We've talked about that the landfill has about 20 years of capacity remaining permitted. I'll only add that that's based on an assumption that the waste volume stays pretty close to neutral to today. I'm bullish that that will go down, not up. When I look back in my career and say, well, what did our waste industry look like 10 years ago? What did it look like 20 years ago? It was very different. Think back 2004, what did our food packaging look like? What did the types of materials that we threw away? What did we do with organics? So the waste tonnage has stayed fairly constant in recent years, a little bit of bouncing up and down. I would tell you, I hope that we see that go down over time. And that 20 years ideally gets stretched into 25, into 30. The comment about C&D is a good one, right? What happens if we boom and we create new waste? So we definitely have to account for those kinds of things. We do the best planning we can, but I do want to remind us all, we think the industry is just going to look a lot different. What we produce as a society and how we manage them 20 years in the future. We do have the one remaining area, the phase 5 area, which I would tell you could theoretically provide another roughly 5 years of capacity. It has a few permits, but is not fully permitted. So we don't say that we have that capacity available or that it will definitely be used. That those are things that will have to be evaluated in the future. A couple of comments about other states. Matt made a reference to Massachusetts. I think he meant Connecticut. There are no solid waste landfills in Connecticut. They manage them all by incineration. There are a handful left in Massachusetts. I want to say 4. There hasn't been a new one in many decades. Maine has several landfills. It has 2 really large landfills, one privately owned, one owned by the state of Maine, and actually operated by us. So we're in the role of being the operator of that landfill, not the owner of the landfill. And all the other states are sort of in different ranges. Rhode Island has a single landfill. New York has, I think, about 30 landfills. So you definitely see differences state to state in terms of how that grows.
How many of those do you operate in these adjacent states or in the region?
Casella owns or operates 9 active landfills, 5 in New York State, 1 each in Vermont, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Maine. Hope I did my math correctly. That should be 9.
That's 9.
The VPR episode that Matt referenced, I think was very well researched. So I would encourage folks to take a look at that. The one thing I would add to that, it does talk a lot about the scale and the financial aspects of that. The other thing I would point to is the expertise aspect of it. There was a time in this country where waste management was a public works department function. And when it was a civil type project, it's just about digging and moving waste, it was perfectly appropriate to be in a public works type scenario. That's not the way it has worked today. And so when I look at the 30-odd staff that work on my team, they include chemists, hydrogeologists, civil engineers, geotechnical engineers. So the amount of expertise that has become required to manage these facilities has dramatically changed. And that's not to say that it can't be done by others, but it becomes a real challenge, whether it's a municipality, whether it's another private company, to bring that level of expertise, plus the time, plus the dollars. And so that becomes a simple barrier to entry to produce and run these kinds of facilities. It's not to say that it couldn't be done. There are states that have multiple landfills. If there were another landfill in the state of Vermont, it would certainly be an option. People ask me, well, would Casella take waste to another landfill that was not owned by Casella? Sure, we would. We do it now. In every other state we operate, we move waste between competitor and our own and municipal facilities. If we don't, somebody will come along and take those contracts from us and take it to wherever it makes the most financial sense. It's time and money and effort. So, waste will move as a commodity like any other commodity, and Casella is not exempt from any of those rules. So yes, we manage things vertically at having collection, having transfer, having landfill, but in no way does that prevent other facilities from being permitted and being built. I do think the monetary and expertise barriers are large, and that makes it difficult for facilities to be built, but it's not to say that it couldn't be done. I'll stop there and see if folks have any questions in regards to tonnage or facilities or the landfill.
Thank you. Representative Weaver.
Thank you. Is any consideration giving to move the waste that's collected in this part of the state by train to a neighboring state that incinerates?
So as an industry, we certainly see a significant increase in rail. We see waste moving from the eastern states out to the western states. You see a lot of waste moving to rail in Ohio, in Virginia, and even further. That's certainly an area I think is of growth. We don't really see a lot of that in Vermont or a lot of opportunities for that in Vermont. We don't have much of the infrastructure in order to do that. Obviously, the presence of the facility, provides that outlet where we've got a facility that can provide that safe and effective means. But when you start thinking about long-term planning, rail transport is a huge, part of that, and many of the states are learning that that's part of their solution. We wonder, and others do, whether our rail system is going to be up to the task of keeping up with those kinds of materials, but it's being done in certain states, and it's certainly a growing area.
So the MRF question, how is it that we're getting out of state MRF into our Coventry landfill?
You're getting our MRFs, so that material is coming from the other recycling facilities that Casella operates in the Northeast. So Matt referenced, it's an approved waste material. So we sought approval as to take that residue and bring it from a transportation standpoint to Coventry as part of a waste management solution. So we operate recycling facilities in Massachusetts. We operate some in Maine. So they produce a fairly small amount of waste, which is typically baled. That's usually the way we can handle that. And then we transport the bales. And so that represents a small but important piece of the waste tonnage that we have gotten approval in order to be able to manage it.
Where does the MRF residual that is created in Vermont go?
It goes to Coventry.
Oh, I see. On the chart, it seemed like it was all out of state.
So the material, the residue that it comes from the Rutland MRF or comes from the Chittenden County facility would ultimately end up as Coventry as waste. It may not be classified that way on that report. So
I guess I'm wondering, because that number was the same in both columns and said out of state. Maybe I'm reading it right, but
in a different realm.
What? So the 30 employees you mentioned, they are working at all of these facilities, I assume, not just Coventry.
I have a team in Rutland that works on facilities throughout, and then I have obviously folks, as you said, throughout the footprint. So yes.
So Rutland's your headquarters. And what are you all doing for planning in Vermont for the future Coventry?
So we certainly are putting a lot of resources right now into PFAS. That's, part of the biggest initiatives, all the way up to John Casella's level, driving toward, providing solutions there. We do have, the long-term planning process of, okay, we had another question, how long is it going to take to permit whether it was expansion or a new facility? So we recognize that there will be a need for a landfill in the state of Vermont when Coventry closes, whether that's 20 years or 25 years or something else. I think it's likely a smaller need. I hope that 25 years in the future, we're landfilling as a society even less than we are today. And so that will certainly be in our long-term planning. I'll admit it's in the long term. Given I'm 20, 25 years out, I think we're more likely to put much more resources into that in the sort of the 10 to 15 year time frame. And then we'll certainly see what happens. Are we going to see the waste continue to drop? Are we going to see it trend upward? What new things are we going to see in our industry? Again, in 2004, there was no organics recycling. There was no construction demolition recycling, no architectural waste. So we think that will change. But to your point, we very much view we're going to have to provide a solution for our customers. And that solution is going to have to be done in time to permit it and to build it. And so I think the company's goals are going to align with the state's goals in that respect. Why would we not have a solution in order to manage our remaining waste?
Where's that questions? Senator Boston.
Yep, sorry. It's a lot of questions. Can you foresee like how to cut back on the waste or what is going into Coventry now? Can you see in the future? Like, I assume everything that we recycle, gets reused again. So everything that goes to Coventry can't be recycled. But can you see of how to limit what goes to Coventry? Like a different way of producing something or building something or something in terms of so much is not going to the landfill?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would start with, we're not that great at recycling. I look at my own household, trying to get my kids to put the right containers and the right materials in the right bin. And I do this for a living, and I struggle to get my own family to put things where they belong. And we see it all the time. We see contamination and recycling. We see what we call wish cycling. People want things to be recyclable, but we don't actually have a way to recycle it. So then we get things in the bin that don't have actual solution. So we need to find solutions for that, find ways to provide more opportunities for that recycling. And a lot of that has to do with the outlet. You can only recycle if I can find a place to take it. So I need industries, I need companies who are willing to use recycled fiber, who are willing to use recycled plastic. The more we say to ourselves, we're only going to ever use highly bleached white paper and we're going to require it to be virgin, we can't use the recycled fiber. And unfortunately, there's a lot of that still goes on today. We've got to get as a society to the place where we say, we're willing to make these purchase choices. We're willing to buy products or even require us to buy products so that it has a recycled % content. And the state can be a leader in that area and its state's purchasing priorities. Create those markets, and industry and private companies will follow and ensure that those materials fill up those opportunities. Yes, there are other areas for diversion. We can improve our architectural and C&D recycling. There's more that can be done with organics. So, it's not only recycling, but I would certainly see that as a major opportunity.
We've taken up a bill that is a result of the Act 131 process that happened over the off session that contemplates kind of putting a limit on the recycled, trying to balance encouraging recycling of materials with limiting a kind of, we're trying to limit the amount of PFAS entering the waste stream. And I wonder if you could provide your perspective on what that equation, because we're going to be asked to make a decision on, should we just ban PFAS in recycled products because of the health risks, or is it better to reuse something and reclaim that material and reuse it, and knowing that at some point it'll probably enter the landfill? Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
So you, I, and everybody at this table has got measurable concentrations of PFAS in your blood. And you got it, and I got it. We're walking on carpets, it's sitting on fabrics, and using like a microwave popcorn containers. We didn't get it from a landfill. We got it because we chose as a society. So I'm a huge advocate of, we've got to stop flow at the source. I'm already going to be serving customers for the next 20 years as everybody gets rid of all their carpets and fabrics. So yes, we got to have a solution on the back end to manage that, because the landfill is going to see PFAS containing materials for decades to come. But we got to stop it on the front end and get that material from not being produced anymore and being able to manage it in an appropriate way. And it's a great start is to say, we want to extend the ban. We want manufacturers to be accountable for where this material comes from. You know, we've got this partial ban that is in many ways voluntary. You don't have the same requirements internationally. So, you know, Matt referenced that 2018 report. I think most of us were shocked when we said, we've sampled all these materials and 95% of them have got PFAS in it. That's crazy. We had no idea in 2018 that was the case. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I would strongly support ways that we can hold manufacturers and others accountable at saying, stop using this material, and really let's have some stringent standards for when the PFAS material that we do have can be used and with what products. We've got to avoid food. We've got to avoid food packaging, things like that.
That was very helpful. My question extends to, what do we allow in recycled products? And whether it's better to get that PFAS all out now, or is it better to recycle something knowing there could be PFAS in it, but it's going to go into something that is not a food product? But I think I'm hearing you say we need to get it out of our rooms, our daily lives.
We do. There's going to be a practical nature of almost everything's got some level of concentration. So are we willing to accept small levels, because then we can take that recycled material and make plastic lumber or park benches or things like that aren't food products, that aren't going to have that level of exposure. I think you're going to have to draw the line somewhere, because we can't shut down our recycling system. We can't say we're not going to recycle all the plastics that we have because we're concerned that they're going to have PFAS in them. But we've got to avoid, as you said, the food products, the food packaging, find ways to reduce those exposures. I think that if you limit, you know, either by quantity or concentration, and I don't envy that, because how do you do that? How do you find that solution?
And in the textiles, people are, you know, increasingly trying to use recycled material to make textiles or clothing even. And, you know, you're just pointing out, many of us have this in us from being in contact with textiles.
I could just add, I'm incredibly proud that the company has done the work to put the PFAS treatment in, and I hope that you would be too. The number of landfills in this country who have some level of PFAS treatment is really, really low. We're talking maybe a dozen facilities, many of which are part-time or still in pilot type work. We've got our own pilot work to be done, but the system is running, and the system is treating 100% of the leachate that's being generated by Coventry, and we're removing it. We talked about it's going into concrete. We view that as a short-term solution. We think the destruction technologies are going to come along, and in another couple of years, there's going to be ways to destroy those compounds, and we support those types of treatment technologies. But most of those are still lab scale or not proven commercial technologies. So we think there's a couple more years. You know, being able to separate it out now and get it into the solid form and get to the landfill is not perfect, but it's a 100% better solution than not doing anything at all. And I make the same comment in regards to that technology effluent. Yes, it's a little bit weird to say we're going to set limits based on what the technology is going to achieve. But the alternative is do nothing and wait for somebody to promulgate standards. And 7 years later, from the initial conversations that we had with the agency in 2017, there are still no state and no federal standards for what we can discharge. So if we waited and did nothing, we would be no further along. So I applaud the state's leadership in saying, we're not going to wait, we're going to do something. Something is better than nothing. And I think we as a society and as a state should be proud that we've made these steps. It's not the final solution. There's more work to be done. We all recognize that. But it's a good interim step. And I think, and I hope that this committee will recognize that there's value that's being provided there.
Can you give us a sense? Thank you. We do. I just want to acknowledge that. And then can you give us a sense of how much concrete is being created?
It's fairly small. So we produce in the neighborhood of 50 to 75 gallons a day. And so you're mixing concrete in a fairly small container, so a few yards a day. So it's not significant in terms of the quantity or the tonnage. We can do it, 2 to 3 times a week and be able to then take it up to the work face. And that actually informed the choice of the technology that we chose. There were others that would have produced a much higher volume of foam, and we've been challenged to be able to manage that level of foam. But the choice of the technology allowed us to reduce that amount and keep that at a very manageable level.
The foam of PFAS?
The foam is still eventually a liquid, right? The foam, it creates a foam, it's heavily concentrated in PFAS, and then the foam collapses and gets back down to a liquid. So now you just have a very high concentrated liquid that's got a lot of PFAS in it. But that's what allows us then to mix it with concrete and seal it into those blocks.
But is the foam itself a PFAS that's attracting the PFAS?
No, the foam is simply a very small portion of the landfill leachate liquid form that, because we're making it so bubbly, the PFAS likes to hang out those bubbles. We're driving the PFAS to hang out on the bubbles. And then when the bubbles collapse, we have this highly concentrated foam.
Skim off the bubbles.
Yes.
And so I see there's other questions, but I'm going to just finish up and ask about, there's a bill on the wall related to pilot programs for PFAS removal. Are you able to comment on your role in that or interest in that? And are you looking for different technologies, or do you think like this, you're satisfied with the one you have?
We're supportive of that bill, absolutely. The way we view it is kind of what I said earlier. There are destructive technologies that we want to be able to evaluate. And what I think we learned, along with, I hope the agency as well, was it was difficult to permit, a technology that doesn't have a huge track record, that we're still trying to figure out exactly how it's going to work. And I think, 4 different permits for that facility. So the idea of creating a system where we can at least evaluate technologies, we're limiting the time frame, so it can't go on forever. I believe the bill says it can only be for a year, but it creates basically this opportunity to evaluate technology without having as many, I'll call them hoops to jump through, which you're going to have to jump through again eventually in the long term. There's no question that you will. You got to get all those permits eventually. But to even evaluate the technologies and see how it really functions, how it works, how it manages in Vermont's climate, we very much view that bill as a great solution to advance that goal.
And you would use it to try something entirely different than what you're doing?
Probably we would use it to supplement what we have now. So is there another step that we could take to even better concentrate the PFAS? Can we take the foam and can we destroy the PFAS in the foam instead of mixing it with concrete? Could we pre-treat the leachate and get some benefit before going into the foam fractionation. So we think of it as, hey, there are opportunities around technology that we've already selected.
Representative Chapin and then Tom Nivea.
In the way you're managing it now, and that foam is getting encapsulated and then landfilled, is that accessible down the road if there was a technology that enabled you to then take it out and destroy it, as you're suggesting might come down the road?
And the short answer would be no. As you filled the landfill, as the roughly 1,500 tons comes in, we lose access to those materials. And now they'll always be encapsulated within the facility. So we're very confident that even if the leaching is not 100%, if we lose a little bit coming out of the concrete, it goes right back in the loop. We capture it and treat it. We don't want to wash. Like, we can't be recycling PFAS round and round and round. But if every concrete block captures 95% of the material, I'll happily manage that 5% coming back around. And that's a great solution, especially in the short term.
Representative Tom Nivea.
I think you answered my question. Representative Chapin pretty much had the same question.
Representative North.
I have a more basic recycling question, different than the PFAS line of question. And I get asked this by constituents every now and then, which is just in general, in the mixed recycling that we do here in Vermont, we throw everything in the blue bin. How much of that, how efficient is that process? How much of that goes in the blue bin actually gets recycled? And how much gets landfilled?
So the residual percentage at the MRFs, and that's really what that is, like how much material that comes in the front doors of that MRF doesn't actually go into the recycling streams and creates that residue. It's roughly 10%, give or take.
Only 10% is waste out of the recycling. The other 90% actually gets recycled.
And I know everybody's time demands are tough, but if the committee can find time for a field trip, going to see the MRF is high on the list. I think for most people, it's eye-opening exactly how much technology goes into and how successful we are in actually sorting all these materials. And kind of to the earlier question, that's a great opportunity. Technology is going to continue to advance. We've started looking at robotics. We've started looking at new ways to get even better with that. Now, in a way, the better we get at cleaning up our recycling, the higher the residue gets, because we find more material that actually can't be recycled. So there's value to that. But the reality is it was never supposed to be in that stream to begin with. So when people put a battery in their recycling bin, or they put a piece of wood because they don't want to see it go to the landfill, that can't be recycled. And so that's the solution we got to get at the front end. Can't solve that at the back end.
One more just follow-on question then is it true then that 100% of the blue bin recycled material collected in Vermont actually goes to these Vermont MRF site facilities and gets recycled? It doesn't just somehow end up going somewhere else and dumped?
Absolutely. 100% of all blue bin material must go to a recycling facility, and the state would absolutely enforce an action on us to do that. I will point out that there are split body trucks, meaning the trucks has two containers on it. So it is possible that in your community, you can get material picked up, recycling and waste, and it's on the same truck. We get asked all the time, I saw them, they put my recycling in their garbage truck. No, it's a split body truck. It's got two containers. But 100% of the blue bin material goes to a MRF, and it can't go anywhere else.
Thank you, sir. I get asked that question frequently, and nice to have a nice firm answer. Appreciate it.
Morris. I knew.
You know. Thank you for coming in, and yeah, I am one that is full support of Casella and the efforts that you have and undertaking. And my question is similar to Representative Norris, sort of. And that is, I participate in recycling in my community, and I know the trash goes in the trash bin, and I know there are tons of people that everything goes in the trash, that they don't recycle or separate at the MRFs. So my question is, I know it gets landfilled just the same. Is that PFAS or those materials, if they go into the landfill, are we to assume that the PFAS is being captured in the leachate then? And that's how, and my fear is it's public education and trying to get people to sort and dispose of it in the proper bins. So it does get recycled correctly. But I know there's so much of it that just goes in the trash. And so I'm concerned. I always think it just seems like such a waste. It's on the front end, but people aren't taking advantage of it. Is that material, when it goes to Coventry and gets landfill, are those waste components or chemicals being captured in that leachate? Is that what we're left with?
So, one of the studies that we did was to try, in addition to characterizing the concentrations and all those materials, we're very fortunate in Vermont. We have this robust waste study. So Vermont can tell you how many couches get thrown away, how many fabrics. So when we tied those two things together, we said, we know how much waste is coming in. We know how much PFAS is coming in on those wastes, and we know how much PFAS is going out in the leachate. So I can measure it. Our best estimate is somewhere between 90 and 95% of the PFAS stays in the waste. So it's sitting in the landfill, not coming out of there. What you see in the leachate is only 5 to 10%. Does that 5 to 10% have to be managed effectively? Absolutely. And that's the reason for the treatment, for the technology. But as a solution to manage those waste materials, the landfill provides that encapsulation and ensuring the vast majority of that mass stays right where it needs to be. Let's get it out at the front end. Manufacturers stop using it. Let's make better choices about the materials we buy. But to the extent that we have to manage it, it's being encapsulated within the landfill.
So it's safe to assume that that landfill then will be in operation, at least for leachate processing, for many years after landfill is closed.
The federal and state law requires us at a minimum to run the landfill and monitor the landfill for 30 years after the closure of the landfill. And there is no get out of jail free card on the 30th year. If it's still producing leachate and still have to be managed, that Casella is still on the hook. And that could, however long that takes, 35, 40, 50 years. That's the law.
My community owns one of those Superfund sites that's still paying for that. Well,
Very similar.
Further questions? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Helpful. I'm sure we'll ask to talk with you again. Thank you. All right, members, we have a little bit of a break, and then we're going to do some bill introductions. Not missing someone in my head.